This is Stephen Cook from the Council on Foreign Relations, and I'm happy to be here with...
This is Mustafa Akyol from Turkey. I am a columnist for the Hurriyet Daily News, an Istanbul paper, and I'm also a columnist for Star, another paper which is in Turkish. So my job is to comment on Turkish politics.
And what's your awesome book, Mustafa?
Oh, by the way, I have an upcoming book, forthcoming book, which will be published in the U.S. this July. Its title is Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty. It's basically an argument for a Muslim liberalism.
I'm very excited about reading it. I'm sure all the people who are checking in on this blogging session will be interested.
Thanks so much, Steve. Thanks so much.
Well, it's great to be on the line with you, Mustafa. So there has been a tremendous amount of commentary about Turkey in the Middle East, Turkey in the Arab Spring. Anthony Shadid had a big piece in the Weekend Review section of the New York Times saying, can Turkey unify the Arabs? I've weighed in a couple of times on this issue. I didn't make myself too many friends among official circles in Turkey. And let me I'll briefly go through what my argument is, and hopefully you'll be able to respond. Basically, my argument has been, for almost 10 years, the Justice and Development Party have been telling us that they have special insight into the Middle East, and they have special knowledge of the Middle East, and that's one of the places where Turkey can be an asset to the United States. And I think what the Arab Spring has revealed is that Turkey really is no different from any other country, and that its special insight into the Middle East was really not a tremendous amount of insight at all. The initial response to what was happening in Libya was to line up with Muammar Qaddafi. They have been reluctant. Of course, now they are fully on board with NATO, and Prime Minister Erdogan has been very clear in calling for Qaddafi to go. But that took some time. And in Syria, the same kind of thing. Turkey has invested enormous amount, not only financially, but also politically, in Bashar al-Assad. And it is an essential piece of Turkish Middle East policy. And it has taken quite some time for the Turks to move away from Assad, and it's not even clear at all that they have. And so my point was that really what we've seen in Turkey is, despite the rhetoric about Turkey having some sort of special knowledge about the region, is that Turkey's interests were wrapped up in dictators in the region. And this is really no different from anybody else, and is having as hard a time managing the situation and their interests during this time of upheaval and change in the Middle East as virtually everyone else. Mustafa, are you there?
I'm here, and I see your point, and I agree with most of it. Well, actually, I never thought that Turkey knows the Middle East better than the United States. I mean, in the United States, you have tremendous amount of scholars, think tank experts, including you, obviously, who know a lot
Thank
about
you very much.
And you're welcome. I mean, I doubt that anybody knows anybody in Ankara knows Egypt better than you, to be honest. So I don't think Turks. I mean, if Turks claim a deeper knowledge of the Middle East, I think they're a little mistaken there. I think, but what they have also implied by that, and which has some truth, is that Turks have a cultural code that they share, especially this current government. They can understand some of the local issues better because they feel it at home, or they have the same Muslim culture, they have some similar political history. So the idea that we can talk with these people and make a sense with them, that has some truth. Besides, Turkey doesn't have the same history that the U.S. or some Western powers have in the region. In terms of, Turkey is more trusted as an actor, especially this Turkey, the Turkey, run by the Justice and Development Party. So I think there is some truth there. That's why the Iranians, are more willing to negotiate a deal via Turkey rather than, someone else.
Right. Right. No,
so I think there's some truth there, but yes, you're right. I mean, nobody foresaw the Arab Spring, and Turkey did not foresee it either. That's why Turkey's zero problem with neighbors policy was caught off guard, because it just ran into the risk of what I called zero problem with dictators. I mean, the people that we were making friends with were dictators. So that was certainly a problem there.
I put that article up on my blog.
Oh, thank you. And I use your articles a lot too, so we share a common point there. Thanks so much. Like the thing
let me
is,
ask you a question about this 1 second,
yeah,
Mustafa. I don't mean to cut you off,
sure.
but let me ask you a question. You made a very important point about Turkey sharing a cultural code and an ability to understand some of the local conflicts better than outsiders, like, for example, Americans. And that Turkey doesn't have the same kind of baggage that the United States does. Although there is that little thing called the Ottoman Empire, which colonized the Middle East for many years. But let's set that one aside.
Well, that's debatable. I mean, in North Africa, the Ottomans are seen a little better than in Iraq and Syria. They have different histories. But I see your point.
I'm playing games with you on that one. But so if they had this kind of cultural code, which I agree with you, and that this ability to deal with and understand local conflicts better, it seems to me that in theory, at least, that is the case. But in practice, it didn't work all that well. I mean, from my understanding, Prime Minister Erdogan spent time on the phone with Muammar Qaddafi and kind of imploring him to do the right thing, to not attack civilians and so on. And it really hasn't gotten Turkey or the Libyan people anywhere. The same thing with Assad, for example. The Turkish Foreign Minister Davutoglu, said that Syria needs to undertake a kind of reform shock therapy. Now there's all kinds of recriminations between Ankara and Damascus because there's a belief that Assad lied to Davutoglu. So with all of this kind of the kind of cultural code that is impenetrable to outsiders, where has this been leveraged by Turks to the benefit of people in the Middle East and their aspirations for transitions to democracy?
Well, I agree with you that in the final months, it didn't work too well with Libya and Syria yet. Like, I would go back a little bit forward. In Turkey was almost convincing Syria to make a peace deal with Israel. Well, that failed because Turkey could not understand the cultural code of Israel. That's a different thing. And Turkey was able to bring Tehran to sign something which was like a nuclear swap deal. But again, Turkey this time did not understand the cultural code of Washington perfectly. So, that didn't work perfectly too. But there were cases that Turkey tried to convince some actors in the Middle East to a more reasonable position. And they seem to have some, I think, promise in some cases. And especially with the Syria thing, it seemed to have worked. So this is a long time.
On the peace process, yes. But in the current situation, it seems to, Assad has now overtaken the Egyptians in terms of killing people. But I agree with you. I think that, and we've discussed this before, over coffee and whatever, that, I agree that Ankara really took it on the chin after 2005 when the Bush administration was trying to isolate Syria and the Turks were developing relations with them. I thought that was unfair to rap the Turks for this because it did prove to be useful. And I've said this before, that if it was, I'd rather have Tayyip Erdogan talking to Bashar al-Assad than Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, or Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the Iranian leader. So I thought that was positive. But now when we're getting to this point where, here is Prime Minister Erdogan, the leader of a party that has, for lack of a better term, maybe you have a better one, of Islamist roots, that is forging a new democratic Turkey. Yet, when it came to his particular allies and Turkey's financial interests in the region, lined up not necessarily with freedom, but lined up with Qaddafi and Assad. He was way out ahead of everybody else when it came to Egypt, far out ahead, and it made it seem as if, wow, the Turks really do understand what's going on. But I think that they really got tripped up when it came to Libya and Syria.
Yeah, no, I agree with you.
Go ahead.
I think in the Libyan case, Turkey realized that something that it has been criticizing for ages is also relevant for itself, which is being caught between realpolitik and moral values. because from the beginning of the Libya conflict, we first heard from the government, Turkish government, that we have workers there, we have to evacuate them, and that was a valid point, and they were very successful in doing that. 25,000 people were evacuated to Turkey. That was great. But then we kept on hearing, oh, we have business interests in Libya. And then I remember telling a friend of mine, well, you see, that's why we have been criticizing the Americans for ages, like for being not very principled when it comes to, having American companies in a country and not criticizing the regime enough for its, human rights abuses. Or we can say that we can bring the same criticism with regards to the U.S. when we speak about Bahrain, because, the U.S. has great relations with the Bahrain government, so the human rights and abuses in Bahrain were not as necessary, criticized by the U.S. as strongly maybe it should have been. So I said, well, maybe what we have been criticizing is what we are doing right now. So maybe that's fact of life. You should, understand that, countries are different. So when you have a special relationship with a country because of your economic interests, or because that you have a border, as we have with the Syrian the government, then you have other considerations than just pure, humanitarian, moral, considerations, which are very important. You should not diminish those values. But Turkey was not ready to grasp, wrestle with this, because until the Arab Spring, Turkey basically said, we are making friends with our former enemies. We'll be friends with every government in the region. We will try to solve the problems between them. We will foster free trade and free exchange of goods and people. And that's something I think which is really promising. I mean, in the long run, this kind of soft power approach and a Turkish approach which promotes a more open Middle East in terms of lifting visa agreements requirements and promoting trade and investment in the region. That's, I think, very important. But Turkey also came to the point of realizing, what we really do when a government that we're friends with starts to kill its own people. And
that's precisely
that was a new question. That was a new question, and in Libya they could not give the right answer as fast as it should have been. But ultimately, in Libya as well, I think the government has come to the point of realizing that Qaddafi should go. Now, Turkey is great with the Libyan opposition. They're meeting in Istanbul, but that was not the case 2 months ago, and that's where Turkey really didn't know what to do exactly.
Let me ask you a couple questions. First, I agree with you 100%. I think that ultimately, if Turkey is going to be an influential actor in the region, I think the most enduring part of it will be its economic relations with these countries. Turkey is quite obviously an engine of economic growth right now. I'm a little shakier on the soft power. I mean, if I hear one more time from another Turk that Egyptians are watching Turkish soap operas, I think I may kill myself. But to me, that's not an indicator of the importance of Turkey's role in the region. But I certainly agree that to the extent that Turks are investing in Egypt, it's good for Egypt's transition. To the extent that Turkish entrepreneurs can be found throughout the region, I think that will be an enduring legacy. And that if Turkey, the 15th or 16th largest economy in the world, can help drive economic growth and jobs in these countries, I think it'll be. I think over the long term, it will seal Turkey as a regional, important regional influential actor. But I think right now it's a little too early to tell. But let me ask you two questions. One, you mentioned the border with Syria, and that's a rather long border with Syria. What precisely, besides the fact that Erdogan invested a lot in Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, what exactly is the concern? Is it actually that there will be Kurdish refugees pouring over the border into predominantly Kurdish southeastern Turkey? And is that a fundamental reason why the Turkish government has been reluctant to essentially drop Assad and is seeking or has sought a solution that included Assad? Is that a driving factor? That's my first question. And my second question for you.
You want me to answer the first because the first one?
Well, let me ask both, and then you can go on if you like. How has Turkey's policy in the region, policy towards Libya, policy towards Syria, policy towards Egypt, towards all of these countries that are undergoing change, how has that played with the Turkish public? Because I'll tell you why I asked that. Because in many discussions in Washington about Turkish foreign policy, there's often an argument that there is a domestic component to it. That Turkey's foreign policy in the Middle East is very popular with the Turkish people.
Let me begin with your second question and come back to the first.
Sure.
First of all, I mean, as for your point on Turkish soap operas in the Arab Middle East, I think we Turks have an inferiority complex when it comes to Hollywood. So we are so thrilled by the fact that some Arab people are watching our soap operas. Maybe we're exaggerating that. As for the soft power argument, I mean, trade is certainly important, and I'm an Hayekian in some sense. I believe free trade will transform society. So I think there's some important point there.
Right.
But
Agreed.
As for the soft power argument, it's not just soap operas, and that's really a minor thing. But I think more important thing was, well, Turkey itself and also the AKP itself was an example. I mean, people speak about the Turkish model, and I think it's an exaggerated term, but AKP itself, as a party, with all its mistakes and all flaws, moved from something that we can call from Islamism to some form of post-Islamism. And by that I mean the party which was really promoting some form of an Islamic government to something called conservative democracy. And we can find it too conservative from a European liberal perspective, and we can sometimes accuse the AKP to be not liberal enough, certainly from a true liberal perspective, but they promised some change and they realized an important part of it. I think that gave an inspiration for people in the Nafta of Tunis, or the Islamic movement in Tunis, or the more liberal elements, the more reformist elements in Ikhwan Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, to say, well, we can be like that as well. We don't have to aspire for a theocratic Islamic regime. We can be a part of the democratic game, as Turks have done, the Turkish Muslims have done, the pious Muslims of Turkey have done through AKP. So I think that was a clear, a soft power effect that I have seen. I have even seen this in Malaysia
let me interrupt for 1 second
about that.
Let me interrupt for 1 second, and let's be clear to our audience that when we're talking about the Turkish model, when you referred to the Turkish model, you were talking about a specific justice and development, AKP-led move from Islamism to post-Islamism and leading the country towards democracy, as opposed to the old Turkish model, which people in Washington often refer to as the military in Turkey playing a moderating role, a so-called moderating role through its interventions in the political system. That's not what you were referring to. You were referring to something entirely
different. No, that's not what I'm referring to, certainly. No, that was a bad Turkish model. And actually, that model had its influence anyway. I mean, but that movement, that model also had parallels with the Ba'athist coups and, military, quasi-military regimes in the military. It was not something unheard of. What the AKP experience is a bit new in the sense that, in the Middle East, there has been this vicious cycle between westernized, more secular lifestyled, elite, and a pious Islamic, society. And that vicious cycle, conflicted with each other. And the secularists in the Middle East are often very, authoritarian sometimes. In places like Algeria, for example, they have been the ones who block democracy. Now, Turkey has been able to break that cycle, I think, with AKP. We still have a problem, discussion between the secularist camp and the conservative camp. But in Turkey, we have been able to overcome the crisis there through a democratic system and through a democratic evolution that the AKP has shown. So I think in that case, I talked this with the advisor to the Lebanese prime minister, a Sunni advisor, obviously, and he said, well, now AKP shows that you can be a good Muslim, but you can also be a part of the secular game called democracy, and you can aspire some Western, values, although you still disagree with the West when it comes to Gaza. So there will be disagreements because, liberal doesn't mean that you think like the West all the time in foreign policy issues. But, AKP has been, I think, able to give that. Yeah, exactly. So, not you do, but some people do in the West, I would say. So,
now, what about
I think AKP has been able to give that message out.
Right.
Yeah, sorry. So, you had your first question as well. I missed that, right?
No, the other question was how is the policy in the Middle East? How's the Turkey policy in the Middle East playing with the Turkish public? As I said when I originally asked, there's always a sense of the discussion here in Washington that, Turkish foreign policy, and Erdogan in particular, Prime Minister Erdogan in particular, given that he's a populist and a brilliant politician by almost every measure, that there is a domestic component to Turkey's foreign policy. So how is the current approach? Does it appeal to the public? Or has there been a lot of criticism?
It appeals to the public. I mean, of course, Turkish public is very divided. So if you speak about a Turkish public, you should ask which Turkish public. Right. It's like speaking about Red America versus Blue America. We have those divides in Turkey as well. So the conservative camp, the people who vote for the AKP, who have a heart for the bygone Ottoman Empire and some of its values, certainly are proud of the fact that we Turks are back in the Middle East. Even Turkish nationalists would say, well, we are a more important country right now. We feel so more like a prestigious country, so we feel honored and, we feel we feel better right now because of the importance we have. There has been a camp which criticizes the AKP, and I think some of their criticisms are also valid, for involving in the Middle East in a very biased way, especially when it comes to Israel-Palestine, when it comes to issues like Hamas. The AKP has been accused in Turkey by mostly the people who know the West, like the more westernized foreign policy elite, to be too emotional in issues like Palestine, and sometimes not using the language of diplomacy, especially when it comes to Erdogan's, the prime minister's rhetoric. And I think those criticisms have a point. But generally, I think in Turkey, AKP is criticized not for its foreign policy that much, but mostly for internal reasons. And even the Turks who criticize AKP on other things would say, well, it is, I think, fair to say Turkey is a more influential country in the world, which not just includes the Middle East, but all the Balkans. And, there's more articles about the West in more articles about Turkey in the world's media. I think those things generally make most Turks proud.
Well, it was my sense that the argument in Turkey is not about foreign policy. The argument's about domestic politics. And in fact, we hosted a delegation from the Republican People's Party, the CHP, the party of Ataturk, a number of weeks ago here at the council. It was a very small meeting, myself, a few others, and about 5 senior members of the CHP. And you did get a sense that, for all of their criticism of the Justice and Development Party and all their criticism of Prime Minister Erdogan, they were proud of Turkey's, their perception of Turkey as a regional leader. The fact that people were even debating this was something that I think was important to them in terms of Turkish pride. But I will tell you, you mentioned the just to get back to your answer about the foreign policy in the Middle East being popular, and that there has been some criticism of the Prime Minister for rhetoric with regard to Israel. It has not gone unnoticed in Washington that whereas Prime Minister Erdogan was very, very tough on the Israelis, and in fact, to some, crossed the line when it came to the Gaza operation, it came to the flotilla incident, that he has not been equally critical of Bashar al-Assad for killing Syrians, for using tanks to shell residential neighborhoods of cities in Syria. That is something that, people pick up on. It's not necessarily a function of some pro-Israel bias, but just a function of the fact that, here are, 2 countries that Turkey has strategic relations with, and whereas one, Erdogan, as you pointed out, got quite emotional, the other, they have been active. There's been an active Turkish diplomacy, but hardly used the same kind of rhetoric that was directed towards the Israelis.
Yeah, you're right. And I think that is a tendency, not just in Erdogan, but like the common, that's a common Muslim attitude. And I've been critical of this. I myself am very critical with regards to some of Israel's policies. I was really very, disturbed when Israel attacked Gaza in a way that, killed hundreds of civilians. But I also see that, Muslims are more enraged when a non-Muslim power kills Muslims. But they're less, enraged when a Muslim like a ruler like Assad or Qaddafi kills Muslims. So there is it's an emotional thing, and I think it's a wrong emotion, and we should not have a double standard on that issue. And I think Erdogan also played into that emotion. He has that emotion too as well. And I think the Israeli-Palestinian issue has become such an iconic thing that whatever happens in Israel, between Israel and Palestine, becomes such a big news. Whereas other problems in the Middle East sometimes goes unnoticed. That's wrong. That's not fair. But that's also a reality, and that reality is all around. And I think Erdogan also voiced that opinion and emotion. It's more of an emotion, I think, rather than like a well-calculated, I think, opinion. And as for your question about Turkey and Syria having the border, Turkey has its longest border with Syria. It's like a very long, more than 500 kilometers. Like it used to be, it's still there, but barbed wire and landmines and so on, because the two countries were very tense for a long time. The Turkish rapprochement with Syria, some of those troubles have gone away. And actually, the Prime Minister, maybe you can recall that instance, Prime Minister Erdogan wanted to demine and demilitarize that zone, the border, right. And he actually was planning to give the job to an Israeli company, and he was accused in Turkey by nationalists for being too pro-Israeli. Whereas Turkey has these like interesting things. Erdogan can be criticized for being pro-American, in Turkey.
Right.
He's very often criticized being too pro-American. So that's
what Erdogan,
position, including secular positions, say.
From everything I understand, Erdogan developed a good working relationship with Ariel Sharon. He went to Jerusalem. He signed 17 agreements, visited the Holocaust Memorial Yad Vashem, signed his name in the book, and had a good working relationship with Ehud Olmert
until 2008.
Until 2008, when the Israelis launched Operation Cast Lead, the military incursion into Gaza. It has been an interesting number of twists and turns for Turkey in the Middle East. I'm wondering, we should probably turn to domestic politics. We are, it's May
to finish your question.
Oh, yes.
Sorry. I couldn't, just two sentences. Yes, Turkey is concerned about possible refugees from Syria. They could be Kurdish, they could be Arabs. But, we had the same thing when Saddam was attacking the Kurds, so we had to call the Americans to help in 1991. So Turkey is fearful that there will be a huge influx of refugees. Plus a destabilization of the Kurdish situation there can also, influence Turkey, because the PKK, the guerrilla group which is fighting against Turkey, which is a terrorist group by most definitions, by U.S. and Turkish definitions, is also supported by some Syrian members. So if the Syrian Kurds get destabilized and more radicalized, that can mean more recruits for the PKK. So Turkey is concerned by all of these questions. So I think in Syria, Turkey is on the one hand urging Assad to be sane and not kill his own people, but at the same time trying to work at a solution, a consensus solution, because an instabilized Syria will be also a huge problem for Turkey.
I realize that there's quite a fair amount of military censorship in Turkey, but have you heard any of these reports that the Turks were planning on, the Turkish military, should the situation in Syria get worse and Turkey is confronted with the possibility of large numbers of refugees crossing the border, that the Turkish military would establish a safe haven within Syrian territory for refugees, that actually the Turkish military would invade, move into Syria up to a certain point and create this safe haven? Is that something that is being reported in the Turkish press?
I've heard that more so in the international press, not in Turkey. I think, right. I mean, I could
those military censors in Turkey work well.
I mean, I could guess that Turkish military might be doing such a plan, but I don't think the government will launch such an operation without some international legitimacy. So we will see. But, I don't think Turkey will do it unilaterally and, look like invading Syria.
Right. In years gone by, they would do that. I started to say it's May 31st, and we are 13 days away from an election in Turkey. This is going to be a big election, too, because the plans are to start drafting a new constitution sometime after those elections. So what's your prediction?
Well, in Turkey, almost everybody is sure that the AKP will be the winner of the next elections as well. This will be the third time that they're winning. Just the question is how big their Sorry?
They're going to go. They're going to build on their 47% win in 2007, or will they drop?
We'll see. I don't know. there are polls showing they will be even bigger than that. There are some people who estimate a 50% electoral victory. Some people say they will fall down a little bit. but everybody is pretty much sure that they will be something about 40%. And my guess will be that they will be around like some 45-ish. We will see. But
okay, you're in the 40. I'm going to say 39.8.
That's your call?
That's my call. 39.8. And we'll email.
Okay,
let's promise to email on June 13th to see who's closer.
Okay, then let me say my estimate is 43.5. So we'll see.
Okay. The Blogging Heads audience heard it here first.
Exactly. And so, of course, actually, there is nothing new about the election in the sense that AKP is going to. Seems like the candidate, winning, candidate. What is new in the election is the CHP. The CHP, for our audience, is the second party in Turkey, the main opposition party. Yeah, the Republicans People's Party. And it is the Atatürk party, so it is the Kemalist party, which really claims to uphold the secular tenets of the regime. AKP is not opposing secularism, but AKP is promoting a different secularism, which is less tolerant to religion, whereas, CHP has been very rigid about that. But secularism was everything that CHP was until very recently. But, a year ago, the CHP had a new leader, thanks to a sex scandal. We don't know how it, came to be, but, the leader of the party was caught in a
I was with you in Turkey when it all happened.
Yeah, exactly. I remember that. I remember that moment. Yeah, so he was, caught on tape. We don't know how and who taped it, but with some, colleague that he should not be in that relationship with. Anyway, that changed the leadership, and the new leader, not very experienced, but a more creative man and like a more man of the people, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. He said, I will change the CHP, and he started to appeal to the people that he did not get votes from, that the CHP did not get votes from. So he sounds less, paranoid and more creative. He sounds more like a social democratic party in European fold.
Which is exactly what JHP is supposed to be.
Which is what JHP is supposed to be.
So he's really moved it back to what its traditional supposed to be. Right.
Yeah. The CHP had both. Kemalism is not social democracy. It's a more authoritarian state idea. Whereas, the CHP had that, and at the same time, social democracy is like a mixture for a long time, from the 70s on. And I think it was a reaction to AKP that the CHP has become so rigidly Kemalist in the past 8-9 years. But I think the CHP realized that just saying that, we are in danger and the Republic is going, to darkness, doesn't win votes. So you have to promise people something. You have to address people's daily needs, as AKP does. So now they sound like a bit more, pragmatic, promising party. So everybody thinks that CHP will have some increase in its votes. How much? Well, that's again a good question. The latest in the latest election, they got 21% of the votes, which is their standard, 21, 22, something like that. My estimate will be that the CHP will come something close to 30%. Not 30% maybe, but I expect a 27, 28% of election victory for Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, the new leader of the party, and that will be, I think, good for Turkish democracy.
Well, it's a significant achievement for Kılıçdaroğlu, who's only been the leader of the party for the last year. What I did notice, and what's interesting about what CHP is doing, is that they have been hammering away on populist issues in the way that the AKP has done in the past. So asking people how they on pocketbook issues, how are they, since the last AKP victory, they've been hammering away. And how are they economically, their economic situation? They've been hammering away at the perception in a huge gap between the very wealthy and the poorest. These are all the kinds of things that AKP did in order to build its own political following. The question is whether CHP is tarred by its past of being a kind of insular, paranoid, rigidly Kemalist party. But I think you're right. I think that they'll increase, and it will probably be good for Turkish democracy, because AKP has just been able to basically run the table, and Erdogan doesn't seem to have any kind of break. There's no real check on him. And he has taken the 47% from 2007 as an absolute mandate, and I think diverted from the pragmatism of their first 5 years in office, and has moved in a different direction. And this is something that I wanted to get at, is that it's clear that Turkey is more modern, more prosperous, a more complicated, complex society than it was 5, 10, 15 years ago, and a freer society, a more democratic society. But there are some problems. There has been this wide-ranging investigation into this conspiracy called Ergenekon, in which members of the Turkish military, members of the Turkish nationalist elites, and what's called the deep state have tried over the years to destabilize the AKP government. There has been punitive tax fines levied against the Doğan Media Group, which has been, its newspaper, Hurriyet, which you work for, has been critical of the government, and that's raised questions about, the AKP and Prime Minister Erdogan's commitment to freedom of the press. There have been other tax issues with other large business concerns that are not seen to be allies of the AKP. And then, of course, we have recent arrests of journalists. And then, of course, last September there was a referendum in which there was a change in which the government can appoint judges, and some people express concern that this opened the door for the AKP to pack the courts with its own loyalists. So there are some concerns that have been raised, and it has in Washington left people wondering whether Turkey is whether Turkey's trajectory is actually one of a liberal democracy or an illiberal democracy. My own answer to the question is it's too early to tell. Turkey's in the middle of a transition. It's not quite at the end yet, but there are indeed some troubling signs. How do you what do you say about those criticisms that are often heard here inside the Beltway?
Well, here's what I would say. I mean, the whole Ergenekon case is very gray area. It's not black and white. And here's my sense. I think Turkey, the more democratic forces in Turkey, had to do something about this traditional alliance with the military, some parts of the media, to just get rid of any government they didn't want. I mean, it is for a foreigner, it's hard to understand why a military coup can be based not just on the military but also some civilian elements. But that has been the case in Turkey forever. But I think there has been excesses. There has been excesses because I think the prosecutors who are backed by the government, in their zeal to find the coup makers, I think have gone extreme in some cases, and just started to pursue people who maybe share an ideology, but maybe who are not in an illegal network. So my sense is that Turkey had to have these cases because there's really a nasty military establishment which planned military coups, which sometimes executed people. So we have to check those people, and I think some of the people in prison are really those people. Whereas I think some people who are just, not criminal but ideologically linked have also been persecuted, and that's a problem. So we should continue criticize those excesses of these cases, but we should not think that they are totally bogus as some people claim. That's one thing. The other thing is, yes, I mean AKP does not sound as liberal as it did 5-6 years ago. But the people for a long time focus on the so-called Islamism of the AKP. Oh, there's a problem with AKP because it is too Islamic-minded, it's Islamist ideology. Well, I've always said, AKP is not too Islamic, it is too Turkish. I mean, in the sense that it's a Turkish political party with classical problems. I mean, Turkish politics is patrimonial, it's leader-dominated. The Turkish politics is nepotistic. So when a party stays in power for a long time, the more it appoints its own people to bureaucracy, and they become too much of a counterweight to other social groups.
Which is, of course, something that any other Turkish party's never done. They've packed the bureaucracy in the courts themselves.
Yeah, I mean, when a Turkish political party comes to power, they appoint their people to everywhere they can, and that's a problem. That was a problem, with other governments. That's a problem with the current government. So there are certainly important problems, and or Tayyip Erdogan's style of politics. I mean, he's a man who dominates his own party. You don't criticize Erdogan if you're AKP, but go and try to criticize Bahçeli if you're MHP. So it's the same thing. Or even
that's the nationalist
Baykal had such a Yeah, that's the third biggest party, the Nationalist Party. So there are certainly structural problems, and these problems need to be criticized, but they need to be criticized in a more constructive way. Whereas when people turn them into conspiracy theories, Turkish secularism is going and it's being replaced by a theocratic government, that's not the case. No, that's not the case. A theocratic government would not do EU reforms and all the things that has taken place in Turkey in the past 9 years. So is Turkey becoming a liberal democracy, an illiberal democracy? Well, Turkey is becoming something in between, I guess. It's becoming more democratic in the sense that the aspiration of the common people finds more echo, I think, in governance. The aspirations of the people are sometimes liberal-leaning, sometimes not that liberal-leaning. So Turkey has to learn how to actually organize its democracy, it's the will of the people, with liberal principles that respect the law of, the supremacy of law and the rights of every individual. So Turkey is grasping with these issues, struggling with these issues, and constructive criticism from outsiders, I think, will be always helpful. And I think AKP needs those certainly constructive criticisms. And now the thing with AKP, another thing is that they are in power for like 9 years, and there's another election they will, it seems, certainly win. So they don't, it's too much of a power. I mean, power corrupts, it corrupts everybody. It corrupts AKP as well. So there's just a general tendency of politics to, when you're in power for such a long time, you have a hard time and you get used to, like politics, you get used to power, so it becomes easier to sometimes overuse your power. And I think those issues are the ones that Turkey will, speak a lot and wrestle with in the years to come.
Well, it was certainly, I think you're right. I think everybody kind of expects the AKP to win this one, but it'll be very interesting to see how the CHP does and whether that, in fact, creates some sort of check on this party that's been in power for 9 years and perhaps force a more pragmatic path, and maybe the AKP can break through some of those particular problems of Turkish politics. Anyway, I think, Mustafa, we are coming to the end of our allotted time. It was a tremendous pleasure to chat. I'm looking forward to seeing you in a couple months when I arrive in Istanbul. Let's reconnect after the election and see whether your 43.5 or my 39.8 is which one's more accurate.
Certainly, Steve. And just a final note, like my book, and Islam without Extremes, a Muslim Case Liberty, addresses some of these issues because it just infers some lessons from Turkey's experiment with democracy in terms of how we can have a more liberal democratic, more liberal Muslim culture.
That's great. See, I'm looking forward to reading
it. Turkey's story is interesting in that case, but I look forward to having that, dinner and kebab with you and discuss where we're going.
Looks great. Okay, man. Good to see you or speak to you.
Good to see you.
See you soon. Thanks.
Good to see you. Bye-bye.
Bye.